ضيف الفقرة دي في نهارك سعيد زي ما قلت في مقدمة البرنامج هو واحد من أهم الكتاب السياسيين المؤرخين المحللين السياسيين وأيضا منتجي الأفلام. هو طارق علي. طارق علي هو بريطاني من أصل باكستاني، ولد في لاهور في 21 أكتوبر 43 وله عدة روايات، حوالي 7 روايات، بالإضافة إلى أكثر من 20 كتاب في أمور مختلفة، في الأصولية الدينية، في علاقة الولايات المتحدة بالعالم، في أمور خاصة بباكستان والحكم العسكري في باكستان، أمور عدة. لكن من أشهر كتبه هو سلسلة روايات هي الحقيقة تسمى خماسية الإسلام أو The Islam Quintet. هو موجود بسبب هذه الخماسية هنا في مصر اليومين دول، تحديدا لأن مكتبة الكتب خان قررت أن هي تترجم أحد هذه الكتب، وده تاني ترجمة ليها، وهو كتاب صلاح الدين. كتاب صلاح الدين بيتكلم عن هذا القائد العربي العظيم، واختارت المكتبة اللي هي تترجم هذا الكتاب. هو موجود علشان يوقع على هذه الترجمة. Mr. Tariq Ali, welcome to Egypt and welcome to our program, and we are very honored to have you here.
I'm very happy to be here. I like this city. I've been following the events of the last 3 years quite closely, so it's nice to have the opportunity to visit it again.
How many times did you visit Egypt before?
In this century, about 4 times. In the last century, about 3 or 4 times. The first time I visited Egypt was a very bad time. It was the defeat, after the defeat of 1967, and you saw in the faces of the people, all people, upset, sadness, not anger, but sadness. And
depression.
Yes. And of course, Gamal Abdel Nasser was still in power, so it was a very different Egypt. But I've never forgotten that experience of coming after.
I knew you were a fan of Nasser yourself.
Yeah, because we were growing up. We were growing up in Pakistan. We had governments which were totally created by imperialism, which were pro-American, pro-British. The Pakistan government supported the invasion of Egypt. So growing up 12, 13 years old, we were saying we wish we had a leader like Nasser in Pakistan. And it was the first time we went to demonstrate on the streets in Pakistan was in defense of Egypt against Suez. We closed our school down and marched out to join a huge demonstration in favor of Nasser. So this played a big part in our own political development.
Yes, excuse me, I have to translate this. أنا كنت بسأل أستاذ طارق علي عن زيارته لمصر، فهو قال إن هو زار مصر الحقيقة كذا مرة قبل كده، يعني في هذا القرن أو القرن الحادي والعشرين هو زار مصر 4 مرات، وقبل كده في القرن الماضي زار مصر 3 مرات، منهم مرة مهمة جدا هي بعد النكسة 67، وكان بيتكلم قد ايه ان الناس كانت وشوشها ما فيهاش غضب على قد ما كان فيها حسره وكان فيها حزن شديد جدا. فانا بقول له، فهو بيقول اللي كان عبد الناصر هو اللي بيحكم وقتها، فبقول له انا عارفه ان انت من عشاق عبد الناصر، فليه كده؟ يعني ليه سبب حبك لعبد الناصر؟ فقال ان هو كان في الوقت ده بيقاوم الامبرياليه العالميه، وكان نموذج مقاوم مختلف تماما، حتى في الوقت اللي كان فيه كتير من الدول ضده، كانوا هم بيخرجوا في مظاهرات ضد حكوماتهم دعما لعبد الناصر. Well, I'd like to talk about the Islam Quintet. It's a very important project. You wrote it in 20 years, actually. And you were... Why did you do it? Let me listen. Why did you do it? Because I learned and I read that you were not actually interested in Islamic history so much. When did it come?
It came in 1990 with the first, 91 with the first Gulf War. And I heard a very ignorant guy on BBC television saying that the Arabs are a people without a political culture. So I wanted to know for myself, what our history was like. And then I wanted to know the history of Islam in Europe and what happened, because this very few people know.
Yeah.
So I went to Spain and spent 3 months, and I thought I would write an essay. But when I saw the monuments, the mosque in Cordoba, the Alhambra in Granada, many other things, I imagined what life must have been like in the last days of Islamic civilization, and the novel came to me.
This era is very attractive for so many writers. The downfall of Granada and Andalusia.
Yes.
It's really very attractive to writers. Why? Why is it so attractive?
Because in a way it was a period where three cultures coexisted together. When Islam took Spain, the Islamic civilization, in many parts of Spain, people changed their names to Arabic names, but they remained Christians and they remained Jews. And these three great monotheistic religions learned how to live together, to debate each other, sometimes to fight, but usually to live in peace and harmony. So that becomes a very important period for the world in which we are living now.
طارق علي بسأله عن خماسية الإسلام اللي هو بدأ كتابتها الحقيقة من 20 سنة. فقلت له انت ليه اهتميت ان انت تكتب عن التاريخ الاسلامي، على الرغم ان انا كنت قريت ان انت ما كنتش مهتم قوي بالحكايه دي. فقال انا اهتميت بعد تحديدا حرب العراق، لما سمعت بعض الناس هو وصفهم بالجهلاء على التلفزيون من الغرب بيتكلموا عن ان العرب والمسلمين او المسلمين ليس لديهم ثقافه سياسيه. فقال انا كان لازم ارجع للتاريخ الاسلامي وادرسه، وتحديدا في الاسلام في الغرب، وارجع لحضاره الاندلس وارجع للاسلام في الاندلس وغرناطه واعرف ايه اللي حصل. فكان بيتكلم على حاله التعايش، وده رصدها في روايته الاولى في الخماسيه دي، عن حاله التعايش الرائعه جدا اللي كانت حاصله ما بين الاديان الثلاثه، الاسلام والمسيحيه واليهوديه في الوقت ده. فبيقول لي دي كانت حاله الحقيقه هامه جدا اللي هي تدرس، حاله التمازج الشديده دي. What about our book for this visit, the Book of Salahuddin?
This book was very important to me because it was an attempt to depict the Crusades, but not from the Christian side, but from the side of the occupied peoples. Because we know what happened during those Crusades. Jerusalem was taken by the Crusaders. There were huge atrocities against the Jews and the Muslims. They behaved like barbarians, and they were regarded by Arab civilization as barbarians, the Franks who came here. So it was an attempt to show what it was really like, and Salahuddin was a critically important figure. For many reasons. He was tolerant, he was cultivated, and he took back Jerusalem. And he took it back and said this must be a city for all the people of the book, not just Muslims, but Jews. State subsidies were provided by Egypt under Salahuddin for the Jews to rebuild their synagogues. We're talking of the 12th century. The Christian churches were not burnt down. They were allowed to practice. So that image of Jerusalem as a city for everyone is a very important thing for today's world, where the Israelis, forgetting the past, forgetting the history, think it's their city. But that was never the case. It was a city for everyone.
بسأله عن كتاب صلاح الدين، السلطان صلاح الدين، وهو تاني كتب خماسية الإسلام اللي هو كتبها، والكتاب اللي هو ترجمتنا اللي هو موجود بسببها هنا في القاهرة. فبيقول إن صلاح الدين شخصية عظيمة جدا ورائعة، وكانت شخصية فيها قدر كبير من التسامح. والمرحلة دي هو كان حاول اللي هو يحط في الكتاب بتاعه رؤية المحتل، مش المحتل ولكن المحتلين، او رؤيه العرب مش رؤيه الغرب بالنسبه للحروب الصليبيه. وبيتكلم ان برضو في الوقت ده صلاح الدين كان واضح ان هو مهتم قوي بفكره التعايش اللي كانت موجوده، وانه كانوا الكنائس لم تحرق في هذا العصر، في عصر صلاح الدين، وكانت موجوده، وكان متروك حريه العقيده لكل الاشخاص. فبيقول ان هو دلوقتي لما تعمل نوع من المقارنه بين اللي حصل واللي بيحصل في إسرائيل دلوقتي، وإزاي إسرائيل بتحاول تحتكر القدس لنفسها معتبرة أن القدس لها وحدها، يعني ليست مدينة الأديان أو مدينة الله. فده يعني بيخليك تفكر في الموضوع أكتر. When does the Islam Quintet ends? The last part.
The last novel, Night of the Golden Butterfly, is set in the contemporary world, in a country I do not name, but it's Pakistan. But it travels.
Your country.
Yeah, my country. And the characters travel. It's a global world. So it's London, Paris, New York, Karachi, Lahore. But in this contemporary novel, I find a way of telling the story of a huge uprising by Muslims in China in the 19th century, in which the Muslim rulers of a state in China unified everyone to fight against the Manchu dynasty. They tried to defeat that dynasty. And for some years, they ran a state which was very tolerant and which created peace and harmony. And I was amazed when I discovered this story. Many Chinese people didn't know about it either. So that is the one bit of past history in this contemporary novel. Because I ask, where did these Chinese cobblers who made shoes in the Chinese shops in Lahore come from? And I imagined that they were refugees from the 19th century who sought refuge in India against persecution.
بسأله اللي هي الخماسية بتخلص فين، فقالوا بتخلص في العصر الحديث، بتدور أحداثه في منطقة ما هو لم يذكرها، لكن هو بيقول هي في باكستان الحقيقة وفي لاهور اللي هي مدينته، وبيقول إن هي كمان بيبقى فيها نوع من الفلاش باك كده أو أجزاء بترجع للماضي برضو بتتكلم عن الإسلام في الصين، وإن برضو حالة التعايش، يعني هو برضو دايما مشغول بحالة التعايش اللي كانت موجودة، إزاي كان حالة التعايش دي موجودة في الصين، والإسلام لما دخل الصين كان إزاي في الحالة دي عرفوا يخلقوها. You are really interested in the intolerance and in peace in your writings, aren't you?
Well, what I try and show is that the periods of which I'm writing, Islamic civilization was tolerant, open-minded, permitted dissent. So this view is exactly the opposite view held by many propagandists and ideologists in the West, but also by many, many Islamic fundamentalists who don't want to recognize this truth about their past. And they say, yes, but that is why they were defeated, because they were like that. If they had been hardline, we would have still kept those countries.
Who created the Islamic fundamentalists? And the jihadists, who created those?
There was always a hardline current, literalist current, like this in Islam from the beginning. If you look at the early history of Islam, how many of the Khalifas were killed? The transitions were always very bloody. And you had a civil war within Islam in the early period. And it could never unify itself as a force. But where its civilization expanded to what is now Spain and Portugal, or Sicily, or through the Osmanlis, it actually brought a great deal of enlightenment with it. This is what people don't want to remember.
What brought them back? What brought them back? These ideas, those people?
Well, you know, I think we have to explain to people that that this is what early and late medieval Islamic civilization was like. There were huge debates, discussions, fights over philosophy, the Baghdad philosophers versus the Andalusian philosophers, not at all like today, the image which is created and which exists of rigidity, dogma, refusal to have serious discussions, and the whole culture becomes a closed book. That was not the case.
كنت بسأله عن الأصوليون والمتشددين واللي هم نشأوا منين، أو اللي هم مين اللي أنشأهم، فبيقول لي ده كان اتجاه موجود الحقيقة في التاريخ الإسلامي القديم منذ قديم الأزل، وكان في هذه الاتجاهات المتشددة في عصور كتيرة، وأكيد كلنا عارفين ان في عدد كبير جدا من الخلفاء قتل، وكان بسبب هذا الفكر المتشدد اللي كان موجود في بعض العصور الإسلامية. Some people think that these fundamentalists and jihadis are actually made in America. Do you agree with this?
No. I think that's no. I don't think they're made in America. They're the result, in some cases, of U.S. policies in other parts of the world, especially the Arab world. But that doesn't mean that the Americans have manufactured them. They worked with them.
They're not a tool.
They're not. No. They were. Many of them were when the Americans were fighting the Russians in Afghanistan. That is when many of these groups were created, armed, trained to fight the jihad against the godless communists in Afghanistan. So that is how many of them were formed, but then they broke. After the Gulf War, we know this as a fact, that they broke with the United States because American troops had arrived in Saudi Arabia and other parts of the Arab world, and they said this is unacceptable to us. So they turned on them and changed their policies, just like the United States does. In the 1980s, the Islamists were their best friends, allies, close. In the late 90s, they ignored them, and then they became their enemies, and today they're the main enemy.
The U.S. to the U.S.
Yes. So this, you know, I really think that we have to grow up and not say this was a conspiracy theory, that the United States organized 9/11 so that it could do A, B, and C. It's useless, it's stupid, it makes the whole Islamic world look foolish when some preachers go and say that. No one believes.
They say the same thing about the revolution, by the way, but let me translate first. بسأله عن إن في كلام كتير ناس بتعتقده أو بتقوله أو بتردده إن الجهاديين والمتشددين وهذا الفكر الإسلامي المتشدد هو الحقيقة صنع في أمريكا. فبيقول إن لا، هو ما بيتفقش مع هذه المقولة، وبيقول إن هو ممكن يكون استغلوهم في مرحلة من المراحل في حرب أفغانستان عشان يضربوا القوات الروسية، يعني الجهاديين أمام الملحدين الروس. ولكن هو بيقول ما بيؤمنش قوي بنظريه المؤامره اللي هو بيخلي العالم الاسلامي هو الحقيقه اداه في ايد امريكا، هي بتخلق وتصنع حاجات وبتحرك حياته بلا داعي يعني. The same conspiracy theory is now arousing in Egypt again, saying that the Egyptian revolution is actually an American and Western conspiracy. What do you think about this?
This insults the memory of those people who died to get rid of a dictatorship. Young people killed, whose faces I saw yesterday on the walls around Tahrir Square on the streets. What an insult to say this whole thing was started by the United States. It's crazy. Obviously,
but you agree with the plan of dividing the Arab world?
No, but the plan of dividing the Arab world is not through organizing mass mobilizations and giving people an idea of self-emancipation. That was the spirit of the Arab Spring. If we can do it ourselves. What the Americans did to divide the Arab world was to occupy Iraq, which created and exacerbated the Sunni-Shia divide. If you want to know which has been the most successful aspect of U.S. foreign policy, successful, it is to divide Islam into Sunnis and Shia, so they now fight each other.
The same is happening in Syria, in your opinion?
Very much so.
Yeah.
But again, it's happening after the occupation of Iraq, where they take power away from a secular state, destroy that state, and hand over power to clerical religious parties. The result we see, you know, it's
then why is it not a conspiracy? It's happening in Iraq, then Syria.
But it's happening because
they say it was going on in Egypt through the Ikhwan, the Brotherhood.
I am sure there were people who are, you know, pro-American, but they exist in every part of the world. What can you do? You can't kill people. You have to argue with them. But the overwhelming majority was the stallholder who set himself on fire in Tunisia, also part of an American conspiracy. That's what triggered off the Tunisian uprising. That's how they won, and that is the uprising that triggered off the uprising in Egypt.
كنت بسأله عن نظرية مؤامرة أخرى دلوقتي ابتدت تظهر في مصر، وإن هي بتصف الثورة المصرية وثورات الربيع العربي بأنها جزء من هذا المخطط الأمريكي أو المؤامرة الأمريكية. فقال طبعا ده كلام فارغ، مفيش حاجة اسمها كده. يعني الابرايزنج أو الثورة والانتفاضة الكبيرة اللي حصلت من الشعب لأنهم كانوا عايزين يسقطوا طاغية، ده الحقيقة خرج من جوه الشعب نفسه ومن معاناته اللي حصلت في كده. ولكن بيقول التقسيم اللي قد تعنيه أمريكا هو التقسيم اللي حصل في العراق واللي أشعلوا الفرقة اللي هم زرعوها ما بين السنة والشيعة تحديدا. وبيقول ده ممكن يكون بيتكرر مرة تانية في سوريا، ولكن بيقول إن الثورات الربيع العربي اللي أشعلها الحقيقة هو البوعزيزي اللي أحرق نفسه في تونس وأشعل هذه الثورة. وأكيد كانت حاجات كلها مكبوتة داخل المصريين والعالم العربي ككل. In the light of your learning and studying and writing history, how do you see what's happening in the Arab world now in the light of history? And what's going to happen in the coming, your anticipation?
Well, the Arab Spring is over. We are now in the middle of the Arab winter. Wherever you look, all the hopes that were aroused by the Arab Spring have been defeated in one way or the other. In Syria, we have an ugly, brutal civil war. One side, the Iranians backing Assad, and the Saudis and the Qataris and the Gulf states and Turkey backing the other side. So what the intervention by these regional powers has done is to remove all spontaneity. And so the people... To remove any spontaneity, the self-expression of the people, by making it into totally a military conflict. A civil war which you can win with anti-aircraft weapons and other weaponry of that sort. So it's a grim situation.
Who is doing this?
Well, I think that the West decided that it was a good chance to get rid of Assad like they did of Gaddafi. But they saw the results of what they had done in Libya, that a year after getting rid of Gaddafi, or several months, the US ambassador is shot dead in Benghazi. So they have learned some lessons, and they didn't want to go in directly with their own troops or NATO bombing. They were divided on that. So they encouraged the side which was fighting the regime to do that. And the regime is a brutal regime. It responded in exactly the same way. And so the people who are caught in the middle are the majority of Syrians. And one's heart goes out for them. But I can't support either side in Syria.
And where is it heading in Egypt?
In Egypt, I think, you know, if I was a doctor doing a post-mortem on a corpse, I would ask, how did the corpse die? And I think the corpse died of bullet wounds and deaths on the street. And with the repression that began, and with the complete and total failure of the Brotherhood, Muslim Brotherhood government, that was the worst thing that happened, in the sense that all the hopes of the people depended on that government. And that government, and Morsi in particular, didn't justify those hopes at all. It's a tragedy. He had no vision. Was very stupid, I'm afraid. And the result is that you are now on a transition to what looks like becoming effectively a military government.
بسأله من رؤيته وقراءته للتاريخ كيف يرى الربيع العربي. فقال الربيع العربي الحقيقة انتهى في العالم العربي بالحال اللي وصلت إليه سوريا من حرب أهلية. وبيقولوا إنه لا يدعم أي من الطرفين في سوريا، لأن الموضوع تحول لحرب يعني لحرب شرسه وحرب آلات عسكريه الحقيقه، وقضوا على التلقائيه اللي كانت موجوده داخل الناس اللي حابه تخرج من حاله الطغيان والظلم اللي حاصله. وبيعتقد ان الغرب شايف ان دي الفرصه المناسبه ان هو يتخلص من الاسد زي ما عمل في القذافي، ولكن هم خدوا عبره مما حدث في ليبيا، انه ان ابتدى ينقلب عليهم الحال الى حد كبير بعد اغتيال السفير الامريكي في ليبيا. فبقول له عن مصر ايه اللي بيحصل، فقال طبعا في حاله تراجع حصلت للثوره تحديدا بعد الاحباط اللي حصل في حاله حكم في وقت حكم الاخوان المسلمين اللي اثبتوا فشلهم التام وانعدام او غياب الرؤيه الكامل عندهم. وبيقول ان مصر في الفتره القادمه هي الحقيقه دلوقتي بتعد في مرحله انتقاليه، وهو بيتخيل او بيتوقع ان مصر عائده لحكم عسكري من جديد. I'd like to thank you very very much. We are honored to have you here in Egypt, and we are honored to have you in our studio. Thank you very much, Mr. طارق علي.
Thank you very much for having me.
خلص لقائنا النهارده، لكن فقراتنا لسه مستمره معاك وراجعين بس بعد الفاصل.